When you were in school, you probably had to hear over and over about the risks of tobacco and drug consumption, unprotected sex, driving under the influence, and so on. Whether it was from rigid Wikipedia scripts read by teachers or from interactive plays performed by professionals, we've been exposed to all sorts of attempts at changing our behaviors. But don't worry, school students are far from being the only lucky target of such campaigns. Cancer prevention, inclusion in the workplace, recruitment biases, waste sorting, etc. All of these are very hot topics which the government, as well as companies, are very keen on addressing. All these workshops, conferences, and awareness campaigns are implicitly based on the information deficit model. The term was coined in the 1980s to refer to the theory that if only people knew better, they would make better informed decisions. Take Jamie here. Poor Jamie has a piece of trash and he doesn't know what to do with it. So he just throws it on the ground. That seems to make sense. Comes expert. Expert tells Jamie, no, don't put your trash on the ground. Put it in the trash can. That makes much more sense. And now Jamie knows what to do. So Jamie will never ever more throw his garbage on the ground. That's both a nice story and an awfully inaccurate one. And you know it. You know that taking the car is deleterious to the environment, and that taking the bus could cost no more, hardly take more time, but you still drive to the doctor or the grocery store because, you like the comfort. You also know that drinking alcohol takes the toll on your body, may decrease your learning and memory abilities, as well as increase the risk of heart diseases. But you still drink that glass of wine or go to the bar with your friends, because you only have one life to enjoy. So let's take a look at some evidence for the successes and failures of all these attempts at changing behaviors. What can go wrong, what can go right, and more importantly, how to make it go right. If you can survive a zombie apocalypse, you can survive a hurricane or an earthquake. So use your brains while you have them, get together an emergency kit, and figure out your escape route. That was more or less the message of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or CDC, in the US in 2011. They were tired of spreading messages that got in one ear and out the other ear, so they decided to rely on a more impactful approach: humor. Because you'll agree that it sometimes helps to get away with bad news. And sure enough, the campaign stirred up interest and excitement in the general public. The message was viewed by millions of people who found it funny, catchy, interesting. But did they actually prepare for a zombie invasion? No, of course not. And that means that neither did they prepare for a hurricane or an earthquake. And that is a generality. If 85% of Americans believed in 2015 that being prepared for such emergencies was crucial, only a minority was even partly prepared. A 2015 study by Cruven and Bryant compared several factors between an experimental group exposed to the zombie campaign and a control group exposed to a matched traditional campaign. And in fact, it showed very little difference in actual preparedness between the groups. So the news were actually pretty bad. Not only did the zombie version reduce perceived likelihood of emergency, importance of preparing, motivation to prepare, and self-efficacy, the experimental group also remembered the content less accurately. So overall, a hard blow for the zombie campaign. Okay, now, you could argue that nobody does science based on one example, and that'd be a fair hit. However, let me just present you another interesting instance before moving on to more systematic reviews. A 2009 study by Sloboda and colleagues focused specifically on the drug abuse resistance education program. The intervention was aimed for teenagers and performed by police officers. The point, as you might have guessed, was to curb substance abuse in teenagers. So for the study, 83 school clusters from 6 different metropolitan areas were randomly assigned to the intervention group or to the no intervention group, which was the control group. So basically, the intervention exposed the students to the personal, social, and legal risks of substance abuse. And on top of that, students were solicited to share their personal experiences, to communicate, to take active parts in discussions, and all that was meant to help them develop relevant life skills such as communication, assertiveness, and refusal skills. The intervention also relied on a component known as constructivist learning. By relying on their own experiences and engaging in active deliberation and role play, students were better incentivized to relate the new information to their personal lives and therefore update their beliefs. And it does sound good. The methods have been tested before on other topics, and active learning has already proven its benefits. So, sure enough, the idea behind the program was that having students engage in such activities and engage with the topic, with the supervision of figures of authority, would drive them away from harmful substances. What wasn't expected, however, was the backfiring effect that followed. After 7th grade and 9th grade interventions for the experimental group, measures performed in 11th grade showed higher cigarette and alcohol use as well as higher binge drinking in the experimental group. In other words, the study suggested that being exposed to the DARE prevention program was associated with higher consumption of the most common substances. The study suggested normalization of such behaviors as a potential factor for the results. Let me rephrase. By talking so much to teenagers about what they shouldn't do, at-risk behaviors became normalized in such a way that those who did not previously engage in them actually switched to fit to the perceived majority. That being said, and I'll try not to delve too much into methodology, we do have to note that such studies are to take with a pinch of salt. Longitudinal studies, that is, studies over the long-term monitoring individual changes, are subject to confounds such as attrition. Some participants may drop out of the study selectively due to various reasons and therefore bias the study. For instance, students dropping out of school and therefore leaving the study may be more or less prone to substance abuse. The reliance on officer instructors to deliver the education content might also have hindered the results, whether in a positive or negative way, because of limited fidelity to the intervention planned. In other words, the police officers did not always cover the full range of the program, which of course may impact the outcome of said program. Okay, so I've gathered some evidence, hopefully convinced you that intervention programs and awareness campaigns are not all powerful. What about in general? What are the tendencies? Can we even tell what can work and what will not? Well, we kinda can. There are at least some ideas. Across several studies comparing effects of interventions to curb sexism, promote healthy lifestyles, or pro-social behaviors, several key factors were found to influence efficacy. So the first key point is to clearly define and wisely choose and narrow down the target population. Okay, I may sound like I'm overstating, but it is very important. Several meta-studies have clearly identified that interventions which target an appropriate, specific, and restricted group have better impacts on the general population than interventions which attempt to address everyone at once. Illustrations of this include a case from 1932 and 1933, which I personally find pretty funny, where a book was banned from the USA and then finally authorized, widely published, and all the more read after its advocates appropriately targeted one single person. They made the book land on the desk of a particularly conservative court judge, alongside a mountain of positive literary critique exposing the book's contribution to literature. And surely enough, the next day the ban was lifted. Similarly, Bookchan and colleagues found that health education campaigns had stronger effects on richer populations. This is partly because of higher literacy rates, but also because they had the personal skills and financial resources to commit to preventive behaviors. Trying to address populations that don't have the means to act on what you tell them is likely to fail. And very recently, in 2021, Vernon deduced from a meta-analysis comprised of 73 articles that awareness days, weeks, or months, all these things which are, let me remind you, highly common, which addressed concerned populations, had a higher success reports than others. And you shouldn't be surprised to learn that campaigns about health prevention have higher impacts on medical students, healthcare workers, and or at-risk populations because, naturally, they care about it. And speaking of target population, some of them are rather difficult to talk to. And I know what I'm talking about. Take engineering school students, my favorite mildly sexist population. Or take your first manager in a tech startup or someone else, whichever you prefer. As Smith showed in her 2017 dissertation about individual and organizational factors impacting efficacy, traditional approaches, which primarily provide information about sexism, may provoke reactance. And what's reactance? Well, basically, it's when you tell somebody about facts regarding a situation and that they have beliefs so deeply rooted and they're so confident in their position and legitimacy that they will refuse and refute all the arguments that you may present them, regardless of their accuracy. So actually, the attempt at convincing them strengthened their stance. So yeah, you've guessed it, that's another case of backfiring. Alongside this reactance phenomenon, we find the feeling of self-efficacy. This refers to the perceived ability to act on one's knowledge and not be helpless. You know there's going to be a catastrophe, but do you know what to do? That's self-efficacy. And if you recall my introductory example with the zombie campaign, if humor helped people accept and share the message, it actually slightly decreased their sense of self-efficacy. Another key issue is then how to avoid reactance and promote self-efficacy. This is included in the broader question of how to favor training transfer. In other words, how to make sure that people who follow the program to adopt certain behaviors actually keep these behaviors, make them become a habit, like actually adopt said behaviors. I identified, or more truthfully, other researchers identified, and I'm compiling the evidence for you, two major elements favoring training transfer. The first one is targeting not only individuals, but also organizations. That was a key takeaway of the aforementioned dissertation by Smith. A 2010 meta-analysis study by Awa and colleagues also considered the effect of both types of approaches, as well as combination of the two, on burnout. And the results were clear. If 80% of routine intervention programs indeed led to a reduction in burnout, only those that included organization-level measures had effects lasting beyond 6 months. That's not to say they lasted forever, but most decayed only after a year. And this makes sense. If you put a person in a company that doesn't care about their well-being, no level of personal intervention will prevent them from feeling like crap. The second main element I teased you about is experiential learning. Getting back to my example of sexism in the workplace, several studies have compared the effects of information only versus hands-on interventions to prevent sexism. And several reviews of such programs, like the workshop activity for gender equity simulation, or wages for friends, showed that in order to reach our goals, actual involvement of the participants was crucial. And that's something that's enabled by experiential learning. So what is experiential learning then? Well, some guy named Kolb broke it down into 4 parts: experiencing, reflecting, thinking, and acting. And he came up with that framework in 1984, so that's to say about the time it takes for us to implement stuff we know about. Anyway, the wages game-based intervention has shown its worth in several studies. In the game, 2 separate teams were to climb up the academic ladder, facing several small, innocuous, and more importantly, biased challenges. Those create a divide between the groups, and these groups are then invited to reflect on those small biases they faced in the game, on their experiences, and on how to patch the problem. What this approach aimed to do was to curb reactance through non-controversial topics and to promote self-efficacy by getting participants to actively reflect on what they could do. Let me rephrase once again. The game avoided telling people, "You're sexist," so that it wouldn't put them on the defensive, and it invited them to think, what could I do to make that game less unfair? So that they came up themselves with solutions that felt implementable. Telling your kid not to drink will not make them drink less. Telling smokers that a majority of them drop their cigarette butts on the sidewalk will only normalize the behavior. Telling engineering school students that they are sexist will mostly put them on the defensive and hence conflict and prevent progress. The thing is, awareness and prevention campaigns sometimes can help, but most often they have no impact or even backfire. And behavioral science inputs are hard to implement in real life. So, what now? Should we just give up? Well, of course not. Well, at least I am convinced that interventions don't have to be useless. But they must take into account what matters to the target public. Is it effect? Generosity? Is it respect and responsibility? Is it a sense of purpose, of pride? The thing is, the decision to act on the knowledge transferred to them must come directly from them. But such decisions shouldn't be postponed to months after the intervention. As we have seen, talking doesn't go far, but experiential learning actually provides people with tools to make their own way towards goals they set for themselves and to solve problems they identified themselves. So, what's next? Well, how can we create and break habits? How can we influence behavioral change through rewarding systems? What are the potential positive and sadly negative impacts of such reward? How does emotion interplay with all this? And from a commercial and political point of view, how are all these tools exploited and at the service or sometimes at the expense of the population? I will soon delve into these topics on this very channel from the perspectives of psychology, neuroscience, and social sciences.